On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, is the Royal Navy going on strike? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, I'm going to tell you a deep, dark secret that both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy don't like to say. A lot of their ships don't have sailors on them. I'm not talking about unmanned or autonomous vessels. I'm talking about the fact that the Royal Fleet Auxiliary of the Royal Navy and the Military Sealift Command of the U.S. Navy employ civilian merchant mariners who crew a lot of the logistics ships, actually all the logistics ships, for both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. And in the case of the Royal Navy, there is a impending strike which would cripple the Royal Navy's ability to sustain and support its fleet out at sea. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy is facing a different situation. They're facing a massive shortage in the number of personnel to crew their vessels, along with other issues that are really making it difficult to find mariners to crew their ships. We're going to look at both of those stories and break it down for you. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So here's the story over at Maritime Executive. Union schedules strike vote for Royal Navy's Royal Fleet Auxiliary. Nauticus International, the union representing the officers of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, confirmed in an announcement its intention to conduct a ballot for an industrial action. They plan to launch the ballot on December 6th, seeking authorization to proceed with a strike against the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The UK's National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, which says it represents about 500 of the RFA members, had in mid-October announced that it was planning to launch the strike authorization vote. Okay, Nautilus members have clearly indicated their frustration at the latest offer of 4.5% has not kept up with wages. And this issue is one that is of paramount importance because mariners are finding other employment than being on naval ships supporting the Royal Navy in its deployment overseas. Now, what do I mean by low wages? Well, let's go over to the RFA site itself. This is the RFA site. It's a beautiful site. And let me be clear, the RFA is an outstanding organization. I've worked with the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. I love the history of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. If you ever want to find out how badass the RFA is, go look at their history during things like the Falklands War, and you'll come to appreciate what the RFA are. They are absolutely essential for the Royal Navy to achieve their role. And they man a very interesting fleet of vessels. Ships like the RFA Argus, which is this littoral strike ship they're running, a series of LSAs, these landing ship auxiliaries or landing ship dock auxiliaries that do a lot of logistics work for them. They crew the solid support ship that brings out the stores, the food, the ammunition, and of course they run the oilers. The oilers are the ones that provide the fuel, in particularly the 4 Tide class oilers, which are absolutely essential. But the issue comes down to pay. Here is the advertisement for positions in the RFA. I'm just going to give you the position of qualified deck officer in the RFA with a starting salary of £37,700. £1 gets you about $1.25 right now in the US. So roughly that comes out to be about $47,000. For a qualified deck officer. That is crazy low for a job like that. If you go on here and look at the other positions they have, all of them really are exceptionally low. I looked up the position for the potential master captain in the RFA, $87,000. Again, that is criminally low. That's about 100,000 US dollars. I know that sounds like a lot, but in terms of seafaring wages, that's really not that good. And so why would you want to go be on an RFA ship away from home for months at a time when you can make as much money being a barista at Starbucks versus being on board a ship? Obviously, the RFA is doing something right because if they've been able to keep personnel for this long with that crappy salary, then it must be a good job and people like what they're doing. However, they are not being given the money that they're entitled to. You flip over to the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, and it is a different picture altogether. Let me take you down to the hiring page of the Military Sealift Command. Just note a couple of things. So that entry level for a deck officer over in the RFA was 37,000 pounds, about $47,000. That's equal to a third officer in the military Sealift Command, where they're paying $156,502 with a bonus of $35,688. I sailed for the military Sealift Command. I left as a second officer. I can go back and make $184,629 with a $39,927 bonus. Now, you may be asking yourself, Sal, first off, why don't you quit this gig and go back sailing again? Believe me, my wife has asked me to go back out to sea many times. I don't understand why. I am absolutely lovable to be with. But the issue here isn't the money. I mean, because MSE has been throwing money at this problem for a long time. MSE employs about 5,600 mariners to crew their vessels. The problem is that when you go work on an MSE ship, you're a government employee. That salary, by the way, assumes you work for a full year. Now, let me be clear when I say work for a full year. If you're working as a third officer for a full year, I'm not talking about Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, holidays and weekends off. No. What they want you to work is 365 days a year, 366 on leap years, at least 8 hours a day, plus they factor in overtime in there, so that you are getting at most, remember it says average annual salary. That's what your average annual salary is. If you take time off, if you take leave off, you're not making that money. Oh, and by the way, it's almost impossible to get relieved on time from Military Sealift Command, because for every 5 positions they have, they hire 6 people for them, which means that there's only an overlap of 0.2 of a person. And because of this system operates under the government leave system, basically they operate with a leave system that makes it act like you're on land. You can almost never get off. If you are a brand new hire working for the Military Sealift Command, the amount of leave you get in a year is equal to 2 months, which sounds great. It sounds fantastic, 2 months. The problem is that it's 10 months the rest of the time sailing. When you do your job every day, and I work at a college, I have my weekends off, I have my holidays off. At the end of the day, I go home to my house. I have snow days every now and then, or weather days every now and then. I can take leave when I want and be able to get off. You can't do that sailing. And MSE is burning out people. They are churning and burning through their personnel. And this is creating a problem. So in the case of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, you're not paying enough. You're not paying enough for your personnel, and therefore people are leaving. In the case of Military Sealift Command, you're paying your people, but the pay you're showing isn't exactly what you're getting, because you would have to work the entire year for that. And oh, by the way, you can't get your leave, which means that you can't get off and have any sort of family life. Even though this looks enticing, it looks like a lot of money to go do it. If you're a new government hire, you are only getting 2 months off out of 10 months. Now, one thing MSC loves to do is go hire former Navy, former government people to come, because then they have more leave. But the problem is still the same. You can't get off. You're supposed to be on a ship for no more than 4 months. Yet people are on board for much longer than that, up to 6 months usually. That is because MSC cannot get the authority to hire more people. Instead of throwing money at the problem, they need to hire more people so that they can rotate people around. But there's also another fundamental issue, and that is the quality of life on board. This story over on GCAP just the other day hit. John Conrad did this. U.S. Navy sued over alleged rape of senior U.S. merchant officer. This is a November 29, 2023 story. Tells the story about the first assistant engineer on board the USNS Carson City. First assistant engineer is just below the chief engineer. So that's equivalent to a commander in terms of rank structure for a ship. The first assistant engineer alleges that they went out one night in port. Her drink was drugged, and then she was brought back to the ship, and she woke up in the morning with the captain of the ship raping her. Understand this, how horrific this story is. This story back from 2020 during the midst of the COVID lockdowns. Suicide aboard Military Sealift Command ship prompts unions to call for end to gangway up order. This is on board the USNS Amelia Earhart, where one of the deck officers committed suicide on the bridge of the ship. And let me be clear, I know this story extremely well because I know some of the officers on board this ship when it happened. And Military Sealift Command, when COVID hit, ordered the gangways raised. Basically, they quarantined the personnel on the ship, which sounds fine, except they literally did it one day, did not tell the crew they were going to do it. And that prevented crew members from, getting their cars into long-term storage, getting their medicine from home. And most crazy of all is that they allowed Navy personnel and contractors to come on and off the ship while the crew was stuck on board. And it led to extreme social issues on board the vessel. It prompted the three maritime unions, which represent the mariners for Military Sealift Command. However, as government employees, they can't strike. So even though they have quote unquote union representation, they don't. And these are government employees. This led to a huge issue with the former commander of Military Sealift Command, Admiral Wetlaufer, and the mariners and the unions. And it's also led to bigger issues. This story by John Conrad from August of this year, Midshipman X, the mariner who is alleged to have raped Midshipman X. Midshipman X was a story that came out during COVID about a midshipman at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, a female, who was raped while on board the ship she was doing her cadet cruise. And here's the story about the mariner relinquishing their Coast Guard license prior to the Coast Guard rape hearing. The Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Linda Fagan, who I've met several times now, was grilled in a hearing regarding sexual assault, sexual harassment in the Coast Guard, at Coast Guard Academy, but also in the maritime sector. And obviously the issue of leave and sexual assault, sexual harassment is dogging the issues in the U.S. maritime sector. So here you have two issues going on in the Royal Navy, Royal Fleet Auxiliary. You have an impending strike that's going to lay up their auxiliary vessels that provide the logistics for them because they're not being paid enough. They're being paid criminally low, in my opinion. It's ridiculous, the low salary that they're being paid. On the flip side, you have Military Sealift Command, where the pay is up there. It's higher, but it's nowhere near where it is commercially. Let me be clear, because when you factor in leave and all the other issues, it's nowhere near comparable. If you sail commercially in the U.S. Merchant Marine, you're doing like 1 month on, 1 month off, or 2 months on, 2 months off. You're not doing 10 months on, 2 months off, and being harassed by the crewing office to come back to work. There's a lot of problems. MSE needs to increase its amount of personnel it has. It needs to deepen that pool. I have argued for a long time. One of the things that the RFA does extremely right is they have their own in command of the RFA. The Commodore in charge of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary is a former mariner, either a chief mate or a chief engineer. In the U.S. Military Sealift Command, it's a Navy admiral who, in some cases, may have no idea about it. The current admiral, Admiral Sobel, has got a long experience with MSC. He knows the organization, but the previous two commanders were aviators who never dealt with Military Sealift Command. In the U.S. Navy, SEALs command SEALs, submariners command submariners, aviators command carriers. But in Military Sealift Command, nope, it's mariners don't command anything. And instead, they're stuck on ships and for really long periods of time, and we should not be surprised about it. But this is a critical readiness issue. This jeopardizes the ability of the militaries to be able to deploy. Understand something. These are civilians. They don't sign contracts per se, so that if the hits the fan tomorrow with China, crews could walk off the ship, and all of a sudden, the Military Sealift Command and the Royal Navy's auxiliary forces, their logistics, is tied to the dock because the mariners left because they're not going to risk their lives for crappy pay and for being treated like second-class citizens, which many of them feel like they're being treated as. This is a major problem that the navies, both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy, don't want to acknowledge, but they really should, because in case of a peer-to-peer conflict in the future, logistics is going to be the thing that's a deciding factor. And these two organizations provide the logistics for the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so to be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you can hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon. You'll see either down in the show notes or at the very end a link to it. That'll take you over to my Patreon page. You become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next episode, this is Al signing off.